A fierce blizzard of 1861 tested the settlers of the Great Plains, where many believed their log cabins could withstand anything. But for those who built in harmony with the land, like the native peoples, the storm revealed a timeless truth. Survival is not just about shelter, but about understanding the land itself. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of the old tribes move you, subscribe because tomorrow's legend runs even deeper than this one. The year was 1861, and the Great Plains were in the grip of a bitter winter. The winds howled across the vast open expanse, carrying with them the scent of snow and the promise of something much worse. As Chief Wicasa stood on the ridge overlooking his people's camp, he could feel the storm coming. It was not just the wind that worried him, there was something in the air that spoke of danger, something ancient that only those who listened to the land could understand. His people, the Lakota, had lived through countless winters, but none quite like this. The storm would be fierce, and it would come without warning. The settlers who had recently arrived on their land had built their homes hastily, relying on the promise of civilization and the comforts of their wooden cabins. But the land, the wild heart of the plains, had its own rules, and those who did not respect them would soon find themselves at the mercy of its power. Wicasa turned to his son, Looking Wolf, who had been watching him from the entrance of their earth lodge. "The storm is coming," the chief said, his voice low but certain. "We must prepare. Tell the others to close their doors and make ready for what will come." Looking Wolf nodded, his face grim. The earth lodge they lived in was sturdy, built from logs and covered with hides, designed to withstand the harsh winds and snow. It was not just shelter, it was a symbol of their connection to the land. The walls were thick, insulated by earth and buffalo hides, trapping heat from the fire that would burn through the night. The roof, covered in layers of sod, would keep the snow from weighing it down, allowing the lodge to stand firm. Wicasa knew that the settlers' log cabins were no match for what was coming. He had seen their homes, hastily constructed with thin logs and fragile roofs, built in haste by men who believed the land would bend to their will. The cabins were vulnerable, and the blizzard would tear through them like a wolf through the snow. The settlers had no understanding of the land's ways, no knowledge of how to build for the worst. As the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Wicasa felt a deep sense of responsibility for his people. They were ready, as always, to face the storm with the wisdom of their ancestors. They had built their homes with patience, understanding that the land and the weather would not be tamed. Their shelters were not just structures, they were an extension of their respect for the earth and the spirits that watched over them. Looking Wolf returned to the center of the camp, calling out to the others. Wicasa watched him go, his thoughts turning to the settlers. He hoped they would survive the coming storm, but deep down he knew the Lakota had the wisdom to endure what nature would bring. As the snow began to fall, the settlers in the nearby encampments hurried to complete their cabins before the worst of the storm arrived. In the midst of their frantic construction, one settler, Thomas Eriksson, worked slowly and deliberately. He was a Norwegian immigrant who had seen his fair share of harsh winters, but those who surrounded him on the frontier considered him overly cautious. While the others rushed to throw up the most basic shelters, Eriksson's cabin was different. It was larger than most, measuring 16 by 20 feet, far beyond the typical 12 by 12 size required by the Homestead Act. His cabin was built from logs at least 12 inches thick, carefully selected for their straightness and minimal branching. The construction was slow, each log stripped of its bark to prevent rot, allowing them to dry for weeks before being used. His neighbors ridiculed him, calling him foolish for spending so much time and money on something they saw as excessive. "What are you building? A fort or a house?" one of them had asked, shaking his head as he looked at Eriksson's work. Despite the mockery, Eriksson pressed on. He had worked in the lumber camps of Wisconsin, where winters could be just as unforgiving. He knew the dangers of hastily built structures. The settlers around him, many of whom were new to the land, were in a rush to claim their homesteads and begin farming. Their cabins were a testament to that urgency, quick, single-wall constructions with little thought for insulation. The roofs were often made of raw sod or bark, and the walls were barely more than a few notched logs hastily stacked together. There was no concern for the storm that was coming, no consideration of the possibility that it might last longer than a few days. Ericsson, on the other hand, was not just building for the winter that had come. He was building for the worst possible winter he could imagine. His cabin had double walls, the space between them packed with sawdust for insulation. The roof was reinforced, built with multiple layers of rough-cut boards, sod, and even tar paper. He had designed it to hold the heat of a fire for as long as possible, even in the harshest of storms. To him, the investment of time and resources was not just about surviving this winter, but about ensuring that he and anyone who came to him in need would survive whatever came next. His neighbors laughed at him, shaking their heads as they finished their smaller, less secure cabins. But Ericsson knew that survival in the frontier wasn't about the speed of construction or the cost of the materials. It was about being prepared for the unknown, for the brutal reality of a blizzard that could freeze everything in its path. As he finished the last of his work and prepared the fire for the evening, Ericsson looked out toward the horizon. The wind had picked up, and the first few flakes of snow began to fall. The storm was coming, and he was ready. The storm arrived without warning, as if the very sky had opened its mouth to swallow the land. The first flurries of snow were gentle, almost peaceful, but they quickly turned to a blinding, frozen fury. By nightfall, the winds howled across the plains, carrying with them a bitter cold that gnawed at the bones. The temperature plummeted, and the snow fell in sheets, swirling around the settlers' cabins, threatening to bury them under its weight. Inside Ericsson's cabin, the fire blazed in the massive stone hearth, sending warmth into every corner of the room. The thick walls of the cabin, with the sawdust insulation packed between the double logs, held the heat well. The snow piled up outside, but the wind could not breach the cabin's walls. Ericsson sat by the fire, quietly listening to the storm rage beyond the sturdy walls. He had known it would be like this. He had built for it. But as he sat in the comfort of his shelter, he thought about the others, the settlers who had mocked him for his excessive caution. They had no such luxury. Across the prairie, the cabins of Ericsson's neighbors stood firm against the blizzard, but only just. The wind found its way through the thin chinking between logs, and the snow crept into the corners of the hastily built homes. Settlers huddled together around their small fires, trying to stay warm, but the cold seeped in around them. Their walls, made of logs hastily thrown together, could not hold back the brutal wind. The firewood that had been stockpiled for the winter was already running low, and the settlers knew they were in trouble. William Crawford, whose cabin sat just a mile down the road from Ericsson's, was already feeling the sting of regret. The single-wall construction of his home had been quick to build, but it was no match for the fury of the storm. He and his wife huddled near the fire, trying to keep warm as the wind howled outside. The cold crept in through the gaps in the logs, and no matter how much wood they fed into the fire, it was never enough. Crawford glanced nervously at his wife, who was wrapped in blankets but still shivering from the cold. He had built quickly, but now he realized that speed and efficiency meant little in the face of a winter like this. His cabin was not a fortress, it was a fragile shelter, easily overwhelmed by the storm. The snow continued to fall through the night, and by the early hours of the morning, the prairie had been transformed into a white wasteland. The wind screamed across the land, and the cold reached into every corner of the settlement, threatening to consume everything in its path. But in Ericsson's cabin, the warmth remained. The double walls, packed with sawdust, held firm. The fire burned steadily, a beacon of warmth in the midst of the storm. Ericsson lay awake in his bed, listening to the storm outside. He knew the others were struggling. He had prepared, but most had not. And as the storm raged on, he understood that this was not just about surviving the winter, it was about understanding the land, respecting it, and building in harmony with it. As the days passed and the storm raged on, the settlers' situation worsened. The blizzard, now a full-blown whiteout, showed no sign of abating. The once bright and open plains were swallowed by snowdrifts, and the bitter wind howled day and night. The settlers who had believed their log cabins would shield them from the worst of the storm found themselves struggling to survive. The cold was merciless, and the firewood that had seemed plentiful just days before was now running low. The town of Desmet, the nearest settlement, was in crisis. The snow had piled up along the railroad tracks, and the trains, which had brought supplies and mail, were stranded. The once bustling town, which had relied on the railroad to bring provisions, was now cut off. The stores in town were quickly running out of food, and the settlers who had once mocked Ericsson's careful planning now realized the true cost of their haste. With the trains unable to reach them, they were left to rely on what little they had: firewood, supplies, and the meager protection their cabins could provide. William Crawford had seen enough. His cabin, which had once seemed adequate, was now barely able to protect him and his wife from the brutal cold. The single-wall structure, which had seemed a sensible choice in the beginning, was no match for the storm. The wind howled through the cracks in the logs, and the snow crept in around the edges of the windows and door. His wife, Clara, had fallen ill from the cold, and their firewood was nearly gone. They had been trapped in their cabin for days, unable to leave because of the snowdrifts that had buried the roads. Crawford had tried to shovel out the path to the nearby town, but the snow was too deep and the wind too fierce. The cold was not only a threat to their survival, but it also brought with it the harsh reality of isolation. With no way to communicate with others and no hope of receiving supplies, Crawford realized just how vulnerable they were. The settlers, who had come to the plains seeking freedom and prosperity, were now facing the reality that they had built too quickly and too carelessly. Ericsson's cabin, however, stood firm. The double walls, insulated with sawdust, had proven to be a lifesaver. As Crawford trudged through the snow to Ericsson's cabin, he felt a deep sense of shame. He had once mocked Ericsson's caution, calling him foolish for spending so much time on his cabin, but now he was seeking refuge in that same cabin. When he arrived, Ericsson opened the door, and warmth poured out, a stark contrast to the freezing winds outside. Crawford didn't have to say a word. Ericsson silently stepped aside and allowed him into the warmth. The fire burned brightly in the hearth, and the temperature inside was a welcome relief from the brutal cold. Crawford could feel the difference immediately. Ericsson's cabin was warm, and his wasn't. As the days dragged on, the settlers in Desmet and the surrounding area were forced to face the harsh reality of their situation. The storm raged unabated, and the cold gripped the land with unrelenting force. Inside their homes, the settlers huddled together, trying to conserve heat, but their efforts were in vain. The fires in their fireplaces burned low, and the chill seeped in through the cracks in the walls. Some had already lost their livestock, and others struggled to find enough food to keep their families alive. The blizzard had become a test of endurance, and it was one that many settlers were failing. Ericsson, however, remained calm. His cabin was warm and secure, a sanctuary in the midst of the storm. As the wind howled outside, he sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth. He had lived through winters like this before in Norway, and he knew that the key to survival was not in rushing or cutting corners, but in patience and careful preparation. He had learned these lessons from the harsh conditions of his homeland, and they had served him well on the plains. The settlers, on the other hand, had no such wisdom. They had come from more temperate lands, where winters were less severe, and they had built their homes quickly, without thinking of the future. They had believed that the land would be kind to them, that they could tame it with their axes and saws. But nature, as Ericsson knew, could not be tamed. While the settlers suffered, Ericsson's thoughts often turned to the native peoples who had lived on the plains long before any settlers had arrived. He had seen their shelters, the earth lodges, built with thick walls of earth and covered with hides to keep out the cold. These structures had been designed not just for shelter, but for survival in the harshest of conditions. The native people had understood the land in a way that the settlers could not. They had built in harmony with nature, using materials that were available to them and adapting their designs to withstand the brutal winters of the plains. Ericsson had learned much from the native people, even though he had not directly interacted with them. He had seen the earth lodges and had marveled at their sturdiness. The thick walls of earth, packed with grass and covered with hides, created an insulation that kept the warmth in and the cold out. The roofs, made of sod and earth, were strong enough to resist the weight of snow and wind. These shelters had been built for survival, and Ericsson had come to realize that the native peoples knew something that the settlers did not. As he sat in his warm cabin, he couldn't help but think of the native people's wisdom. Their knowledge had been passed down through generations, a wisdom that had allowed them to survive the harshest winters the plains could throw at them. He had built his cabin with that same spirit of respect for the land. But it was the native people's shelters that had truly mastered the art of survival. By the fourth day of the storm, the blizzard showed no sign of letting up. The wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the trees and rattling the windows of the cabins. The settlers were running low on firewood, their food stores nearly exhausted, and the relentless cold had crept into every corner of their homes. William Crawford, his wife Clara, and their 2 children huddled together for warmth, but the cold still found its way in. The fire in their hearth had grown weak, and the warmth it provided was fleeting at best. Crawford knew they could not survive much longer in the state they were in. Their cabin, hastily built with only a single layer of logs, was no match for the storm. He had heard of Ericsson's cabin, the one that had been mocked by everyone for its excessive construction. Now, as the wind howled outside, Crawford wondered if he had made a mistake in underestimating the Norwegian settler. The thought of reaching Ericsson's cabin crossed his mind, but the storm was so fierce that it seemed nearly impossible to make the journey. Yet, as he looked at Clara, pale and shivering with fever, he knew there was no other choice. The life of his family depended on it. With a heavy heart, Crawford bundled his family in as many layers of clothing as he could find and set out into the storm. The snow blinded him, and the wind pushed him back at every turn. But he pushed forward, step by step, toward Ericsson's cabin. It was a journey that would take him through deep drifts and across treacherous ground, but the thought of his wife and children dying in the cold spurred him on. As he trudged through the blinding snow, Crawford thought back to the days before the storm. He had been one of the many who had mocked Ericsson for his meticulous cabin building. They had all laughed at him for taking so much time to prepare, for spending extra money on materials that seemed unnecessary. Now, as the storm raged on, he realized that Ericsson had known something they hadn't. Ericsson had built his cabin for more than just the winter. He had built it for the worst winter he could imagine. He had learned from the harsh winters of his homeland, and he had applied that knowledge to survive in the wild plains. The settlers had built their cabins in haste, never considering that a blizzard like this could strike. They had underestimated the power of nature and the land they had come to claim. Finally, after hours of struggling through the snow, Crawford saw a faint glow in the distance. The firelight from Ericsson's cabin shone like a beacon through the storm. With renewed hope, he pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived at the door, Ericsson opened it without hesitation. The warmth from inside rushed out to meet him, and the contrast between the heat in the cabin and the cold outside was like night and day. Crawford didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ericsson stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him and his family into the warmth. The blizzard finally subsided, but the damage had been done. The Great Plains, once vast and seemingly endless, now lay buried beneath a thick blanket of snow. The storm had raged for nearly a week, turning what had been a routine winter into a brutal test of survival. For the settlers, the aftermath was a grim reality. Many had lost their homes, their livestock, and even their lives. Those who had rushed to build quickly found themselves in the cold grip of failure. William Crawford's cabin had been one of the many casualties. The single walls, hastily thrown, together with no thought for insulation or strength, had failed under the pressure of the storm. The wind had found every crack, every gap, and the cold had seeped in like a thief in the night. His wife, Clara, had survived, but only barely. She was weak with pneumonia, and their children had suffered frostbite. They had survived the storm, but at a terrible cost. Ericsson's cabin, however, stood firm. The double walls, packed with sawdust for insulation, had proven their worth. The fire had burned steadily in the hearth, keeping the cabin warm even as the temperature outside plummeted to unbearable lows. The thick walls had held up against the wind, and the roof, reinforced with layers of sod and boards, had shed the snow without giving way. The cabin was not just a shelter, it was a sanctuary, a testament to the wisdom of its builder. As Crawford trudged back to his own ruined cabin, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. He had mocked Erickson for his cautiousness, for his meticulous attention to detail. Now, as he looked at the destruction around him, he realized just how wrong he had been. Erickson had understood something the rest of them hadn't. The land didn't care about their haste. Nature would not bend to their will, it would only yield to those who respected it. Erickson had spent days helping his neighbors, opening his doors to anyone in need. His cabin had become a refuge, a place where families who had lost everything could find warmth and safety. He had shared his firewood, his food stores, and his knowledge of survival, never once saying, "I told you so." For Erickson, the storm had not been about proving his wisdom, it had been about survival. And he had done what was necessary to ensure that those around him had a chance to survive as well. But for many settlers, it was too late. The damage was done, and the blizzard had claimed its toll. Those who had survived were left to rebuild, but they would do so with a new understanding of what it took to endure on the plains. Erickson's methods, once ridiculed, would now be seen as the model for survival. The Lakota, too, had weathered the storm without the same hardships. Their earth lodges, insulated by the earth and covered in hides, had kept them warm and safe. Their shelters had been built for the worst, and the worst had come. Wicasa, standing outside his lodge as the last gusts of wind died down, knew that his people's way of life had proven itself once again. When the storm finally passed, the Great Plains were a quiet, frozen wasteland. The snow lay thick across the land, a silent testament to the fury that had come and gone. The settlers, though, were far from quiet. The ones who had survived the worst of the blizzard now faced the grim task of rebuilding. Their homes, hastily constructed and poorly insulated, had proven woefully inadequate against the storm's ferocity. Many had lost livestock, food supplies, and tools, and those who had not prepared properly found themselves with little to keep them warm in the coming months. In the weeks following the storm, the settlers began the difficult work of reconstructing their cabins. But this time they approached the task with more care. The storm had taught them a lesson they would never forget. The land was not something to be conquered with speed and haste. It demanded respect and preparation, and those who failed to heed that lesson paid the price. William Crawford was one of the first to seek out Thomas Erickson. The once dismissed settler was now considered a beacon of survival, his cabin standing as a testament to the wisdom of careful construction. Crawford, humbled by his experience, asked Erickson for advice on rebuilding. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice low with a mixture of regret and admiration. "How did you know to build like this?" Erickson, as always, answered without pride, but with quiet wisdom. "I didn't know the storm would come, but I knew that winter can be unforgiving. I built for the worst." Sometimes, when you prepare for the worst, you find that you've saved more than you expected. The settlers who had once mocked Erickson now sought his counsel. They asked him about his methods, about the double walls, the insulation, the careful selection of materials. Erickson did not hold back. He shared what he had learned, not out of a desire to prove himself right, but because he understood that survival was more important than pride. As the settlers rebuilt, the changes were clear. The walls of the new cabins were thicker, the roofs reinforced, and the chinking more carefully applied. The lessons of the storm were not quickly forgotten, and the settlers now recognized the value of preparation, the importance of building to last. No longer did they rush to finish their homes, hoping to start farming at the earliest opportunity. Now they understood that, without shelter, there could be no survival. Erickson, for his part, continued to help where he could, but he did so quietly. His cabin had become a place of refuge for many, but he did not boast. He knew that the storm had changed everything, and he had done what was necessary to help others through it. Yet, he also knew that the settlers would now carry his lessons with them, whether they realized it or not. The storm had forced them to rethink their approach to survival. Meanwhile, Chief Wicasa and his people continued their lives as they always had, protected by the wisdom of their ancestors. Their earth lodges, like the shelters of their forebears, had proven more than sufficient to weather the storm. As the weeks turned into months, the legacy of the storm became clear to everyone who had endured it. The settlers who had once rushed to build quickly were now rebuilding with patience and respect for the land, having learned the hard way the value of thorough preparation. The cabins that rose from the snow were sturdier, with thicker walls, double roofs, and more insulation. Ericsson's methods had been adopted, and settlers who had once ridiculed him now came to him for advice on how to make their homes truly safe. William Crawford, now one of the most vocal proponents of careful construction, had rebuilt his cabin with the same double walls and insulation that Ericsson had used. His wife, Clara, who had been ill during the storm, had recovered, and the family was beginning to feel secure again. The lessons of the storm were etched in their minds. They no longer saw the land as something to be tamed, but something to be respected. They built to survive, not to rush through the seasons. Ericsson, for his part, remained humble. His cabin had become a symbol of survival, but he did not seek recognition. His life was simple. He worked the land, helped his neighbors, and tended his fire. The storm had changed his life, but he had never doubted that it would. He had built his cabin for the worst, and the worst had come. In doing so, he had saved not just his own life, but the lives of many others. He had shared what he knew, not out of pride, but because he understood that survival was not about individual glory, it was about the strength of the community. Meanwhile, Chief Wicasa and his people had not been affected by the blizzard in the same way. Their earth lodges, built with the wisdom of generations, had protected them as they always had. The storm had been a challenge, but it had been one they had been prepared for. They did not need to rebuild. Their shelters had been built to last, grounded in the knowledge passed down through the ages. The native way of life had once again proven itself superior, not because of fancy tools or new techniques, but because of the deep connection to the land and the teachings of their ancestors. Wicasa, sitting outside his lodge as the winds died down, reflected on the changes he had witnessed. The settlers, once oblivious to the land's power, had learned to build with respect. They had learned what his people had known all along. Survival was not just about surviving the season, but about understanding the land, the weather, and the balance of all things. His people had lived in harmony with the earth for centuries, and though the settlers had come and gone, the wisdom of the land remained. Years passed, and the memory of the blizzard of 1861 slowly faded, but its lessons remained etched in the minds of the settlers who had survived it. The town of Desmet, once a place of haste and urgency, became a community founded on the principles of patience and respect for the land. The settlers rebuilt not just their homes, but their relationship with the environment around them. The land, which had once been seen as a place to conquer, was now seen as something to live with, a partnership, not a battle. Ericsson's cabin remained standing, a testament to his wisdom. Though many settlers had adopted his methods, his cabin stood apart as a symbol of survival, a place where the lessons of the storm had been taught and learned. The double walls, the insulation, the carefully chosen materials, everything about the cabin was a reflection of the hard-won knowledge that had been passed from one generation to the next. Ericsson had built it for the worst, and the worst had come, but it had stood firm through the storm and beyond. His cabin, like the native earth lodges, had proven that preparation, patience, and respect for the land could overcome even the harshest conditions. William Crawford, now a leader in the community, often spoke of the lessons he had learned from Ericsson. He had rebuilt his cabin using the same techniques, but he also understood that survival was not just about building strong shelters. It was about understanding the rhythms of the land, the seasons, and the weather. He had learned that there was no such thing as a quick fix on the plains, only careful, thoughtful preparation. He shared this wisdom with new settlers who came to the region, passing on the lessons of the storm and the shelter that had withstood it. Erickson, too, had changed. He had once been an outsider, ridiculed for his cautiousness, but now he was a respected figure in the community. People came to him for advice, not just on building cabins, but on living in harmony with the land. He had helped transform the frontier into a place where people understood that survival required more than just brute strength. It required knowledge, respect, and a willingness to adapt. The settlers had learned to build not just with their hands, but with their minds and hearts, thinking beyond the immediate to prepare for the future. As the years passed, the story of the blizzard of 1861 became a legend, told and retold around fires and in the homes of settlers. It was a story not just of survival but of transformation. It was a story of learning from the land, of adapting to its harsh realities, and of finding strength in unity and knowledge. The Native American way of life, with its deep connection to the land and the wisdom passed down through generations, had shown its value in the storm, and the settlers had come to understand its importance. And so the land endured, as it always had, and the lessons learned from the storm lived on in the cabins, the lodges, and the hearts of those who called it home.